Perfect. Well, welcome everybody to another episode of the Red Effect Podcast. This is our first one with a live audience. Got some different faces with us, so I'll start right here with Pete Crew. You want to just give us a little bit of background on yourself?
I'm Pete Crew, born and raised on a farm in northwest Iowa. Graduated from Iowa State in agronomy and entomology, dirt and bugs, and been in retail and farming my whole life.
Awesome. And then our very special guest, Fred Belo. Could you please give us a little bit of background on all the accomplishments you have?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here at Red Star. I'm a professor of crop physiology, University of Illinois. Been there for 40 years as a professor, and I'm interested in management factors that affect high corn and soybean yield. Now, I'm not from here. I'm east of that big river, the Mississippi. So I'm gonna say that we might do things a little differently than you do, but I've learned that you have to go somewhere else, see how other people handle problems, and that's how you learn something. So, pleasure to be here with you today.
Awesome. Thanks. We're great to have you here. John?
Well, I'm John Person. I'm the agronomist here for Red Star, and I'm here to learn from the experts in some different parts of the country. So,
Perfect. Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about soybean production. And Fred, I'll turn it over to you and we can get started.
Yeah, so we got to set a goal when we're looking for soybean yield, and our goal is 80 bushels. I mean, it's not the world record, which is 218, but it's certainly a pretty good yield. So that's the target that we're after, and we want to know those factors that if we get individually correct, can lead to 80 bushels. And so what I'm going to ultimately refer to is the 6 secrets of 80 bushel soybean. What does it take? Now, I don't keep her secret very well because I'm gonna ultimately mention them all, and I'll start with the one that has the biggest impact on soybean yield, the one that's hardest to control, and that is the weather. I mean, I think some of you guys in Nebraska have something called irrigation, and that's cheating because that partially determines the weather. But weather has the biggest impact, and I'm going to say to grow, you can have a 30 bushel swing on the 80 bushels of 6 secret. So it's soybean success. So weather. Soybean doesn't like too much rain. It doesn't like to be dry in August. But one of the factors that I'll say is related to the weather, and this is the biggest thing that I've seen in Illinois over the last 5 years, and that is planting soybean before we plant corn. When I was a student, I learned that soybean had a higher minimum temperature required for germination than did corn. Corn's base temperature is 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And I learned soybean required 52 to 55 degrees to germinate. And if that was true, that would mean you would plant corn before soybean. Now, I'm pretty old, and it turns out it was true at the time because at the time we were bin running soybean. Remember when we saved the seed back and of questionable quality, and then we went ahead and replanted it? And boy, we planted 200,000 had to be warmed to get it to emerge. Now that we're planted premium treated seed, it turns out that soybean has the same minimum temperature to germinate than corn. There was a guy at a research station near us, and a couple of years ago, this is 5 years ago, and he worked for the BSF research station, and he planted soybean in March. The word was he was either bored or maybe they made him do it, and we all said, that idiot, that's never going to work. That'll be a disaster, and it yielded 80 bushels. So we said, well, that was a one-off. That'll never happen again. And he did it again the next year, and it was 100 bushels. Then we said, well, wait, hey, we better take a look at this. And so we went back and we looked at all of our soybean trials that we'd done over the last 8 years, hundreds of trials. These weren't planting day trials, but, we could say, when did we plant the trial and what was the yield? And what we saw was it was a straight line down. Every day after April 23rd that we planted soybean, we lost a half a bushel. And by the way, we had never planted soybean before April 23rd because we were so busy planting corn. So we say, well, we better do a planting date study. Next year, we put soybean in April 2nd. 17 days later, we had a hard frost. Every growing point dead on the soybean plant. Every single one dead, but the cotyledons were still green. My question is that crop history? Is that a replant situation? I know if it was corn frosted at all, we'd have replanted it. But cotyledons were still green. If you look very carefully at where that cotyledon meets the stem, there's something called an axillary bud. And so they can regrow in a Y branch. And, we painfully waited for that sucker to regrow. My students freaking out, saying, we got to replant this. I said, no, let's wait. Slow as can be. Didn't close the canopy in June. Couldn't hardly tell in July, and it was 85 bushels. And I went, holy cow, we need to be planting soybean ahead of corn. I don't have to tell all of you guys that corn needs rapid, uniform emergence for maximum yield. I didn't say uniform emergence wasn't important for soybean, but, it doesn't make its yield right out of the ground. Makes it mostly in August. So it is a lot more forgiving. And now what we're seeing in Illinois is we're seeing a quantum shift to planting soybean before corn, or at least planting the two at the same time. This is something that we've researched. We asked the question, well, if we plant soybean early, do we have to manage it differently? Does the row space matter? Does foliar protection matter? Does fertility matter? Does seed treatment matter? These are all the factors that are part of the 6 secrets of soybean success. And so for the last 3 years, we've been planting soybean in middle of April, beginning of May, end of May, and then into June. And I won't tell you it works every time. It's determined by the weather. I've had one time that the April planting did not yield the highest. But on average, if we plant in April, we get a 20 bushel increase in yield over planting at the end of May. Again, it's about a half a bushel per acre per day for every day we delay planting after the middle of May. So I don't know about Nebraska growers. Maybe you figured this out before we did in Illinois. But what I think we will see in Illinois within the next 5 years is virtually all the soybean will be planted before the corn. So what are you guys doing here in Nebraska?
We're getting a lot earlier here. There is some planted first half of April. One of the things we're up against is insurance dates here as far as the planting date. But it is becoming more and more common.
Yeah, so why do you suppose early planting of soybean works so well? It's not just that its emergence isn't important. There's 2 reasons. One reason, if you plant early, is you cover more of the ground with leaves on the longest day. If we could have complete leaf coverage on June 21, then, we think we're intercepting all that sunlight. And obviously, it gives the plant a greater chance to intercept all that light. But here's the real reason that early planting works. When you plant early, that soybean plant has more nodes. At least a node, maybe 2 nodes more. Now, why do you suppose nodes are so important for soybean yield?
It just so happens to be where our pods sit.
Yes, it's one of the yield components of soybean. So, you make soybean yield into a math equation by multiplying the yield components together. It's pod number by seeds per pod by weight per seed. And you got to increase at least one of those to increase soybean yield. You know how you do a soybean yield estimate, right? You throw the hula hoop out, you count the pods, and then you make them some yield after that. Pod number is the one that's the most important. And pod number is a function of node number and pods per node. And if you can put one more pod on every soybean plant, if you got 120,000 soybean plants out there and you could put one more pod on a plant, it's 2 bushels. It seems easy, doesn't it? So if I can get another node or 2, that gives me the chance to have more pods, and that can really increase soybean yield.
Are you changing maturity when you plant earlier in Illinois?
Yeah, excellent question. So this is the other big factor that can impact yield, largely for increasing the number of nodes. Clearly, if you plant soybean earlier, you should increase the relative maturity group. In central Illinois where I'm at, it's 2.7 to maybe 4.2. And if we're planting early in April, it's got to be that 4.2. I mean, we have a longer season. I think the fuller maturity lets us use the full season. But here's sort of the surprising thing. We plant late, if we plant in June, it's also the fullest maturity group for the region that gives the highest yield. Most growers would say, I'm going to run out of season. I got to plant a lower maturity group. That would not be true. The fullest relative maturity typically gives the highest yield, and it's because it also has more nodes. For the last 3 years we've been doing this, we averaged it over all the planting dates. We looked at the impact of relative maturity on yield. We could regress that. And we find that for one full increase in maturity group, we're 6 bushels. And that doesn't cost anymore. So that's a huge factor for us in growing high yield. Plant early, plant the fullest relative maturity for the region.
So part of that, even with the later planted dates, still the fullest maturity is the best. Is it just because that plant all of a sudden knows it's behind based on the time of day, or it's the length of the day, so it's just trying to catch up because it knows it has that hard cutoff? Or
Yeah, so soybean does track heat units just like corn. So up until the time it flowers, it's going to track heat units. But after she flowers, it's a combination of heat units and photo period. And as the days get shorter, it says, we got to finish this puppy up. We got to rush it up. And that's why it produces, I believe that's why it produces less nodes. Now, I'm telling you, plant the fullest relative maturity for the region. There is a caveat to this. And sometimes the seed companies, hate to say it, they simply make the maturity group up. They say, we need a 3.5, and we'll take this one, which is really a 2.7, and we'll call it a 3.5 just because we don't have a 3.5 in our lineup. So when I tell you this, make sure that it is that relative maturity group, or you might get bitten. And it's not that I'm giving you the wrong information. It's the seed company marketing variety.
When you're planting early, are you planting at a different depth? Are you planting deeper planting, or where are we at in that process?
Yeah, so we're in the 2-inch depth when we plant. I mean, just like corn, I'm going to tell you that singulation of soybean is important. If I could singulate my soybean and get it all at the same depth and have it all come up at the same time, that'd be a huge advantage. Typically, if you plant early and you plant a little deeper, it's not as cold. The soybean feels the cold air above the ground, and that slows it up. So yes, I have heard high yield growers say, I put it in a little early. I think a little deeper. I think the record grower does this. Sometimes that soil might crust over, and then I wish I had it shallower. I wish I had a better chance to get it out of the ground. But I think consistency of the planting depth is as important as anything, just to make sure that they're all at the same stage.
We see at these higher populations, you mentioned singulation. We see them using a seed plate that plants that grabs 2 beans. Are you seeing anything different with somebody that's using a corn plate to plant soybeans, or a soybean plate? Has that come up in your research?
So we have not physically done that. I do know that sometimes, I swear, sometimes when I have 2 beans together, one of them helps the other one get out of the ground. It seems to me. I don't know if it's true or not. But I've not compared the different plates on soybean. Obviously, I'd like to have it come up rapidly, and I'd like to have it not crust over. There's always an argument among growers. Do I want a big seed? Do I want a small seed? What do I want the bag of seed to weigh? And since soybean is basically a big embryo, 2 cotyledons surrounded by a seed coat, I will guarantee you a bigger seed will give you a bigger seedling. But you'll have a bigger hypocotyl to push up through that soil, and it's not going to merge as well when it's crusted. So if you gave me the choice, I'd like to have a mixture of seed sizes just to sort of hedge my bet on if the soil's crusted and how they might emerge. Obviously, planting date is a component of the weather. I'm not telling you to plant soybean. I'm telling you to treat soybean just like you would corn. You would say, well, conditions are fit now, and what's the long-term forecast look like? So when I say plant soybean early, I'm not telling you to put it in the ground in the rare March where it's, nice, but it's going to freeze and be solid cold for the next 2 weeks. You have to look ahead just like you would with corn.
The biggest problem we've had in northern Iowa with bean depths is planting them too shallow.
Mm.
We find a lot of really cold temperatures, and we've had them frozen off quite a bit, and the shallower planted ones seem to be more of a problem. Like we talked earlier, the air temperature affects the surface of the soil more than it does deeper down.
Yeah. What I see is the one that struggles tends to be the shallower one as well, particularly if you have those cold fronts after planting. And let's face it, if I'm telling you to plant earlier, it's kind of probably going to be cold above that soil. That is one of the advantages. If you can put it in a little deeper, it's a little bit more insulated from the air temperatures.
And we had a lot of guys in Northwest Iowa now are switching to the 15-row inch, like Kinsey planters that are singulated. Like you said, we mostly just drilled, which was a controlled spill up and down on depth. But when we moved to these singulated planters, the yields have gone up. Like you said, it establishes a canopy quicker and they come out of the ground more even and better.
So most guys in my world would they would plant soybeans in 15-inch rows. They have a dual plate planter. Means one row unit wears out faster than the other, which is kind of annoying, and that planter's heavy. What we see, and that makes some sense if you think about it. When we plant early, when we plant in April, there isn't any advantage of the 15-inch row over the 30. They're the same. I think it has something to do with giving enough time to grow the leaf area to intercept all the light. Now, I will guarantee you, if we plant in June, we better be in 15 inches to intercept more light. It's the exact same thing with population. If we plant early, we can cut the population back. I mean, we could probably put in 110, maybe even 90. But if we're planting late, I'll guarantee it better be 130, 140. Get that leaf area out there as quick as we can. So I would have told you that row spacing was worth 7 bushels on the 6 secrets of 80 bushel soybean, but not if you plant early. That advantage seems to go away. I'll tell you the second factor that has the biggest impact on soybean yield, and this is one that it shouldn't surprise you, but it really does, and that's variety. We're getting the variety right. When I screen varieties at a given site, these are frontline commercial varieties. $60 to $80 a bag. They vary by 30 bushels. 30 bushels by the top to the bottom. Now, it's usually the fullest relative maturity that has the highest yield. But a soybean variety doesn't stay on the market very long. They turn over fast, and that must mean there's a better one that comes along. So, I watch growers. I don't know about Nebraska growers, but I watch Illinois farmers. Man, they agonize for weeks over what corn hybrid they're going to plant. And then they turn around and plant any old damn soybean. Who cares? Is it round? Plant it. Big mistake. Soybean variety makes a huge difference. 30 bushels in our trial, so almost the same value as weather. So if we want to grow really high soybean, we take the fullest, best variety for the region. We plant it early, and we're already 60 bushels of the 80 bushel soybean formula.
So with that, obviously maturity is one factor, but what's another factor you're looking at that really sets that soybean from the top to the bottom? Is it branching? Is it things like that?
Yeah. So if you let me ask you a question. Where are most of the pods located on the soybean plant?
They're on the base.
Yeah, they're in the main stem, in the middle. In between, I'm going to guess that most of your soybeans are going to have 20 nodes that you're growing here. 16 of them that have pods. And they're going to be the great bulk. 60% of the pods in your yield on a soybean plant is going to be in nodes 7 through 13. I mean, branches, as important as they are overrated. Only about 10% of the yield I see comes from the branches. Now I've heard guys say, well, I grown 100 bushel soybean at 60,000 plants, because the thing branched. And that's true. I mean, I'd seen soybean plants that have incredible branches, just incredible. And then what I've also seen is that branch has so many pods on it that the thing breaks off before I can get the combine cutter through there, and then it's on the ground. It annoys me to no end. So if you look at the soybean plant, 60% of the yield's in the middle. The rest of it's only about 10% on the branches. The rest at the bottom and the top. The top, I think, is the target. If you got 100 bushel soybean or better, where I'm going to see it is at the top. I'm going to come out, I'm going to look at your soybean, I'm going to look at the top. It's going to have, four bean clusters, and they're all going to have 3 seeds, maybe even a few with 4. And I'm going to know you have a high yield. Ever look at soybean, at the top of the plant, there's nothing. And you go, why is that? I mean, there's plenty of room here. Why can't I get more pods on there? And that's because obviously the soybean runs out of energy. It's obviously limited by source. So when you have managed the soybean plant for high yield, if you want to look at any indicator at all, look at the top of the plant, and it'll be loaded with pods.
Yeah, and I could say that too with some of the trials I looked at this year. The ones where we applied more nutrients at that R3 time frame, they had that nice cluster at the top, and the ones that didn't, they didn't have that cluster. So it just showed, yes, this is a very valuable application.
So soybean, if you think about it, soybean plants are what I'm going to call indeterminate, right? So they have leaves, they can flower and have vegetation at the same time. They have multiple nodes, they can have pods, and guess what? It is the closest leaf. It's the leaf at that node that supplies most of the energy and the nutrients for the pods and beans at a given node. That's how you can go out and look at soybean and, kind of do a weather archaeological study. You go, this node only has 1 pod, and these pods only have 1 bean, and you know that you were short then. Either drought or you ran out of nutrients or you had disease or something. So, the problem, unlike corn that makes yield decisions at key times, you got to manage the soybean the whole season. You got to manage every leaf at every node to get the full pod and seed potential, that can occur at that node.
One thing that happens that we see very commonly here locally is the top clusters of pods will be on all the beans or none of the beans. And I assume we would probably relay that back to weather. Would that be a correct statement?
Yeah, weather and management. I mean, weather plays the biggest role. But if you run out of, obviously you run out of water, that's going to be the case. Or if you run out of a nutrient. I mean, I don't know about in Nebraska, but in Illinois, I could go out and I could look at the top of the plant and I could find a lot of cases of classic potassium deficiency at the top. And I'm pretty sure I'm not going to have as many pods at the top or as many seeds in those pods. So obviously, weather makes a huge difference, but don't forget the nutrition as well.
On your high yielding beans, are you doing anything with sulfur?
Yeah. Well, sulfur is sort of the missing link, and soybean has a fairly high sulfur requirement. Not only fairly high, but season long. So if you looked at the uptake pattern of sulfur in soybean, you would see that it has to take up a lot of it after the crop flowers. Do you know why soybean needs so much sulfur? Because it is a high protein crop. I mean, your soybean is 34-35% protein. And that's where sulfur is in the plant. 2 of the 20 amino acids in soybean protein contain sulfur. So in order to make the protein that's a huge component of that seed, you need to have adequate sulfur.
In northern Iowa, we talked earlier about timing on sulfur. We've put some over the top, spread it on ammonium sulfate at R2, R3 early on and gotten excellent results. And you talked earlier about putting it on up front. What rates would you use?
Yeah, when I'm trying to run a progressive system of soybean, that's going for the 80 bushels, and maybe my mind is stuck on 80, but I like to put 80 pounds of ammonium sulfate out at planting. I mean, and I'll guarantee if you do that, you'll see it to the row where that ammonium sulfate was. That crop will be greener. That's going to give me 15, 16 pounds of nitrogen. And that little bit of nitrogen and that sulfur can really help that soybean crop get started. Green it up, grow it a little faster, give it a little bigger leaves, give it the energy then before the nodules can take over supplying the crop within. I'm not saying that top dressing it won't work. I have seen it work. But what we do in our high yield soybean systems is we like to get that crop off to a quick, rapid start. We like to see it with our eye, and so we put the ammonium sulfate on at the beginning. Now, I've seen it work with thiosulfate as well, so there's nothing magic about it, but sulfur plays a big role in helping the plant with photosynthesis early on. I mean, hence the greenness. And you put that sulfur on, and it greens that plant up.
So have you seen it too with maybe not AMS, but say like urea or even 32%? Just
I-
because soybeans are so nitrogen heavy. I mean, it takes 5 pounds to create a bushel.
Yep, I have. So we've obviously looked at nitrogen on soybean. I've heard people say, well, in order to grow 80 bushels soybean, you need nitrogen. As you mentioned, soybean has to accumulate during the course of the season 4 to 5 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. Is a huge nitrogen requiring crop. I mean, if you compare it to corn, corn's only a pound of N per bushel accumulated. Soybean is 4 and 5 pounds. And again, that comes down to the high protein that's in soybean seed. Now, let me ask you another question, or let me pose another question. Soybean gets some of its N from the nodules, biological nitrogen fixation. Notice I said some, not all. And so the question is, how much of soybeans' nitrogen comes from the nodules?
Up to 65 bushels.
Yeah, 50%. So enough to produce about 65 bushels, but only half of the nitrogen that soybean needs comes from the nodules. Where's the other half come from?
Got it down from this.
Soil. Yep. Or the breakdown of the previous corn's residue, right?
I think
And-
that, excuse me, I think that's going to be a big issue this year where we've had all the rain and our carryover nitrogen is going to be lower than normal for next year's bean crop.
That means we're going to rely more on the nodules. And if you think about it, take a nitrogen out of the atmosphere into gas, that's got a triple bond. It takes an enormous amount of energy to reduce that nitrogen gas to a usable form. Enormous. It's not free by any means. And so I think what happens, that's why the plant, it's going to take it out of the soil first if it can. And if you rely totally on nitrogen fixation, you're limited in the amount of energy that you have available.
Cold, I got a question that came in is, does double inoculating your soybeans help push that nitrogen level above that 50% that Fred's talking about?
So I'm gonna take the double inoculation question. I think what they mean does co-inoculation. So that would be inoculating with Brady rhizobium and then another microbe that can fix nitrogen, Azospirillum brasilianthes or one of these. We've looked at that and we've not seen an advantage. Maybe it's our soils or our conditions. I struggle to see an advantage of actually inoculating the soybean in my world with, unless it hasn't seen soybean in 50 years. But we seem to have the native Brady rhizobia that do the job. I wish I could say add an additional microbe or additional inoculation, and it would help. I know it's widely done in Brazil, apparently with huge success, but in our research, we've not seen the advantage of it.
So just for a little background on the soils that you're doing a lot of test plots at, I guess some key factors, organic matter, CEC, just to get a general feel of the soil, what would those typically be?
Yeah, so I'm guessing in Illinois, the inherent soil fertility changes drastically as you go from the north to the south. I think it's east to west in Nebraska. I'm not sure, but if I went up to northern Illinois, I could find 5% organic matter soils, and they'd have CECs that are damn near 30. At Champaign, where I live, 3% wouldn't be uncommon. A 20 CEC. But I get down to southern Illinois, and I'm lucky to get 2% organic matter, and I'd have a lot of CECs in the teens or maybe even single digits. So soil type changes drastically in Illinois as you go north to south. I think it has something to do with glaciers, or maybe it's the stuff from Chicago flows downhill. I'm not sure what the reason is, but big difference in soil type. Nonetheless, I still see, regardless of where I am in the state, that planting soybean earlier and planting the fuller maturity variety makes the biggest difference. Do see a difference in disease from the north to the south. A lot more disease in the south. A lot more insect pests in the south. I think they have milder winters, and I think most of the nasty stuff blows up from the south somehow. But other than that, I don't see a large difference.
So just moving on, we've covered 2 of your secrets to soybeans. What
Yep.
would be your third?
3 of them. I said weather was number 1. Planting date is what you can do to control the weather. I said variety was number 2. Both of those were 30 bushels. I said row spacing is worth 7. And that's especially true if you plant late. The number 4 is foliar protection, insecticide and or fungicide. You ever I don't know about Nebraska, but if you look at soybean in Illinois, it looks like somebody took a shotgun to the top of the plant. I don't know. I mean, yeah. So foliar protection worth about 6 bushels. Now we thought that foliar protection might be more important if we planted early and had a higher yield potential, but what we see in our planting date studies is foliar protection is the same value regardless of when we plant the crop. Whether we plant it early, whether we plant it late, we're going to see 3 to 6 bushels from foliar protection. That's one time at R3. You know why I like on R3 foliar protection on soybean? Because you know what nodes I'm protecting, 7 through 13, where 60% of the yield is. So that seems to be a given when it comes to soybean. Keeps those leaves active and a little greener longer. Helps me increase yield by giving me not only maybe more seeds per pod, but also heavier seed weight.
There's been some talk in some circles where ammonium thiosulfate put through irrigation will slower pest activity at about that time. I realize that's out of your area, but is that even a reasonable thought?
It is. It doesn't surprise me. The original fungicide was copper sulfate and sulfur and oxidized reduced forms of sulfur. So I'm not surprised by it. It may change the pH in the plant tissue and help ward off certain diseases. Maybe it makes the leaf not taste as well to certain insects, and it makes the leaves greener. And clearly, I've seen a healthier plant is certainly more tolerant of diseases and or insects in general. So I'm not surprised by that. I was telling you that seed weight, that when you keep the leaves greener longer or keep the plant healthier longer, you tend to get heavier seed weight. Do you know how much you hate when you're harvesting the seed and you call them BBs? These seed are so small, and I'm certain if they were bigger, I'd have a higher yield. Do you know what an average soybean seed weighs? So I can tell you this because I've weighed more of them than I'd care to admit. An average soybean seed, an individual soybean seed weighs 150 milligrams. See, this is a case where we're using metric units to make this appear more scientific. 150 milligrams. Now, I point that out because if I could have every seed weigh 152 milligrams, if I can change the seed weight just 2 milligrams more, that's a bushel. So there's a lot of opportunity to increase soybean yield by increasing the seed weight, and that is going to come down to things like foliar protection and maybe like thiosulfate through the irrigation. Keep those leaves greener longer. So that's number 4. Number 5 kind of surprises me a little bit, because if you hear me talk later today, it's not number 5 in corn, but number 5 is fertility when it comes to soybean. Not as big an effect as you would think, and this somewhat shocks me. Let me say that if I planted soybean earlier and I had a higher yield, you would think I'd need more fertility. But it actually ends up being exactly the opposite. Fertilizer is more important with late planted soybean than it is with early planted soybean, even though the yield is less. Why do you suppose that is? Well, it comes down to the fact that if I plant early, the soybean crop grows slower. And if it grows slower, its demand for nutrients is less, and the soil can supply it. If you plant later, it grows so fast that the soil can't supply what it needs, and you got to have the fertilizer. So fertility on average soybeans were 5 bushels. That's largely P and K fertility, maybe a little sulfur. And contrary to what you would think, later planting requires fertilizer more than early. We also see when we measure the salt test that the high salt test is related to yield in later planted soybean, but not earlier planted soybean. So soybean's a little tricky or sneaky in how it uses its nutrients. I didn't say that you didn't need it. And remember, when you grow higher yield, you are removing more nutrients from the soil, regardless of when you plant it. So by planting earlier, we're certainly removing more. But in that season, it seems to require less. What I see in this is that soybean seems to like old fertility better than fresh. So, the idea in Illinois, we like to fertilize 2 years, allegedly 2. We dilute ourselves in the amount we're putting on for 2. But we like to fertilize the corn and let the soybean use what's left. And if we adequately put 2 years on the corn, that would benefit the corn and it wouldn't hurt the soybean at all.
Now, we actually, in northern Iowa, we have, in our glacial till soils, we have problem holding potassium. So we've noticed in our world where you split that fertilizer up and put that potassium in front of the beans, we've actually gotten pretty good yield results out of it.
And even moving that potassium application into in season when about the same time with the AMS, that also shows a pretty good response as well.
Yeah, well, the soybean's a big potassium user, uses a lot more potassium than corn, actually removes more potassium than corn. So probably has something to do with the clay minerals that you have. Obviously, when it comes down to nutrients that you're going to put on soybean, it's potassium and phosphate and sulfur, I think, are the most important. Don't have much experience myself with split applications of potassium, but I'm pretty sure that having potassium during seed fill is important because, again, I can't tell you how many times I've seen the potassium deficiency show up at the top of the crop, which clearly means I've run out.
In the early planted beans and late planted beans, have you looked at root development there?
Haven't looked at that. Don't know what it does. So can't answer that question. I don't know John, if you know.
Well, one of the things we're seeing is calcium. When we have a high free calcium soil, along with good phosphorus numbers, we can definitely see an increase in yields. And I think this just relates to the fact that of the tie-up of the phosphorus to the calcium and the fact that the calcium helps bring the potassium into the plant. I think it's a base thing that we can look at to ensure that the rest of the nutrients are going to get into the plant.
Yeah, I do know that compared to corn, soybean has 3 times the concentration of calcium. The dicots have 3 times the calcium requirement as grasses do. I think it has something to do with their cell wall structure and the fact that, John, as you mentioned, they have to move a lot more potassium. So calcium is not a nutrient we typically fertilize in Illinois. We try and get the pH right to make sure it's available. But clearly, you have a higher concentration or level of calcium in soybean than you would in corn.
So have you seen it too in your research that adding boron at a key stage in order to maintain pod retention has dramatically helped?
Yeah, so boron, very important for pod and flower retention. You know that the soybean takes the strategy to way overproduce flowers and pods and then ruthlessly abort them back to what the environment will support. I mean, it wouldn't be uncommon for 50 to 70% of the flowers and pods to abort. And if you measure the level of boron in a flower or a pod, it is by far the highest of any of the micronutrients. So there's clearly a huge role for boron in pollination, even though it's a self-pollinated crop, and I believe in flower retention as well.
And two, with boron, since it's immobile in the plant, as it, like you say, ruthlessly aborts those, it would seem to me that as we do that, we are losing some of that boron concentration.
Actually, you're right. That boron's actually lost in those developing. Once it gets into those pods or those young pods or flowers, you don't get to take it back out because it doesn't move.
Another question, guys. If soybeans require 4 to 5 pounds of nitrogen per bushel, and if 80 bushels is your goal, and the plant only supplies 50%, where are you going to get the other 150 to 200 pounds of nitrogen?
Yeah, so I'll paraphrase the question here. We need a lot of nitrogen to grow 80 bushel beans. 4 or 5 pounds per bushel. I mean, look do the math. The nodules only provide 50%. Where's the rest going to come from? It has to come from mineralization of soil organic matter. I mean, it has to be the breakdown of soil organic matter, or it has to be the breakdown of the previous corn's residue, or in some cases, it has to come from fertilizer N. I mean, everybody that's grown the record soybean yields, I'll guarantee they spoon-fed that sucker with a little N. Now you know the problem with fertilizing soybean. It's one of these can't have my cake and eat it too, because if you put on too much nitrogen, you inhibit the nodules. You prevent them from growing. You prevent them from infecting. You prevent them from growing. You keep them from being pink inside. All aspects of biological nitrogen fixation is inhibited by soybean. So, if it comes to fertilizing soybean, you have to do a couple of things. You have to put it in a source that's going to release it slowly. Now, if you have the benefit of irrigating, you can irrigate a little bit at a time. I mean, 10 pounds at a time isn't going to inhibit the nodules. Or you got to put it where it's not too close to the nodule, so it doesn't inhibit it. Or you have to have it in a form that's going to control or slow its release to try and spoon feed the crop with nitrogen.
So like an SRN would be.
Yes, correct. Yes, we had good success with that.
Is there any other forms, like, would you say ammoniacal form of nitrogen is better than a nitrate? Does it not really matter?
It does matter. So the more available, the more readily available forms like nitrate and ammonium will inhibit nodulation. Interestingly enough, if you could supply urea to the soybean, soybean is one of the rare crops that can actually take up urea molecule as urea. Not many plants can, but soybean can. And when it takes up urea as urea molecule, then it doesn't inhibit the nitrogenase. And so I've seen urea with the urease inhibitor that keeps it as urea. If I could get some of that form of nitrogen into the soybean plant, then I can supplement the source without a negative impact on the nodules.
And was that just over the top? Was it infer or in a strip?
Yeah, that was over the top.
So I would say with this whole conversation, balance is extremely important in both the soil and in the plant. Is there any special processes we can do to, encourage that?
By balance, you mean balance in nutrients or?
Yeah, balance the calcium and the boron and the potassium and the phosphorus. Is there any special variety or needs that we could talk about?
Yeah, so I'm going to tell you that to move nitrogen in the soybean plant requires potassium. I mean, if you're going to fertilize your soybean plant with nitrogen and you don't have adequate potassium, you're wasting your time. I mean, you're not going to, it comes down to the lowest common denominator. I will tell you another thing that we have routinely seen is we have seen a synergy between fertility and foliar protection. So in other words, when we keep the leaves disease and insect free, well, then we could use nutrition better. When we have adequate nutrition, we get a better bang for the foliar protection. Those things tend to work in harmony. So those are very different processes, but I think ultimately both come down to the health of the leaf and the ability of that leaf to make sugars and feed the developing pods.
Couple more questions that have come in. What about spraying liquid urea foliar apply on your soybeans?
Yeah, so the question is, can I spray the soybean with foliar urea? That's been tried many times. We've tried that. The problem is there's two problems: getting enough urea into the plant without burning the crap out of it. Remember, I said you need 4 or 5 pounds of N in the plant per bushel. And if you put 10 pounds of urea foliar on the vegetation, you're gonna experience some burn. So when it comes to any macronutrient, nitrogen included, the amount that you can actually physically get into the leaves is limited. Now, micronutrient, another story, but a macronutrient like urea, harder to do. I won't say impossible, but I mean, again, it comes down to, if I'm willing to spray it every day every week with a little bit, I might be able to make a difference without burning the crop and inhibiting the nodules. But I think it's a challenge to get enough in.
No, I've actually had quite a bit of experience with putting urea on beans. We've tried to buy urea so it didn't burn them. And I think the reason a lot of these questions are coming up because there is a trade-off with rhizobium. they don't make their own energy, so the beans got to feed them. And a lot of us have been trying to short circuit that, right? And we've put nitrogen on beans 6 ways to Sunday, and we don't grow the beans like Fred does in Illinois and northern Iowa either. Really the biggest we've ever got is hog manure. When you put hog manure on beans early up front, that's sulfur, that's everything. So, but we haven't in northern Iowa found a lot of response with foliar urea or applied urea.
The hog manure would have extremely available potassium.
Yep.
And that would be, and the
Sulfur.
and the phosphorus in it, if it's been fed with phytase, the hogs have, that should make that more available.
Plus, there's biological activity that comes from hog manure or chicken litter or turkey litter. And I can't tell you the advantage that goes along with that. Not only do you feed the crop, but you're also really stimulating the microbiome of the soil with that material. So that can have a real advantage. And a lot of the people that grow the record yields, I'll guarantee you there's either hog or turkey manure or something in that formula.
Into when you look at like a manure source, that has a lot more carbon in it to feed a soil biology.
Exactly.
A synthetic fertilizer.
Yep. So there's biological activity that helps with the activity of the soil.
We got one question. What about starter fertilizer? In side plant. What's your opinion on starter?
Yeah, so soybean needs nutrition right from the beginning. Think about a young soybean plant. It doesn't have an extensive root system. That root system has an enormous requirement to take up nutrients, particularly immobile nutrients like phosphorus or potassium. I mean, it's just not in contact with enough surface area of soil to really supply those. And in that case, a starter fertilizer that can position immobile nutrients in the proximity of that young hungry root it can really help set the future growth and potential. Now it's not finisher, it's starter. So let's keep that in mind. Don't think that I'm gonna put a little fertilizer in starter and meet the whole nutrient requirements of soybean. That's simply not going to happen. I think it's going to be especially important if you plant early when that young root is cold. Not only is it hungry, but it's cold and it doesn't have the availability. It's not in contact with enough soil to get those immobile nutrients. And so, yes, I mean, just like corn, I can see it to the row sometimes where the plants got off to a better start with those immobile nutrients. Again, particularly when I plant early. I'm going to guess if you plant late, it's probably not going to be as important, but early, yes.
And we've seen starter on beans like on seed, a food grade type starter, 918.9 or whatever. The cooler springs we have, it seems like it's a little better. We get about a hit off of it 50% of the time, and it varies from highest I've seen 1 to 7. So you scatter it out, and it's with the cost of the starter, it just really doesn't pencil out. So we're only getting hits on it about half the time.
Well, I was going to mention the last soybean secret, and this comes down to all the stuff you can put on the seed, seed treatment. You think about seed treatment, that would include your inoculation with nitrogen-fixing Brady rhizobia. It would include protection, like for insects, diseases, and nematodes. You can now put micronutrient on seed. I mean, one that I've seen that we've had very good results with is putting a little molybdenum, moly on seed, because guess what? That's a key component of the nitrogenase enzyme that's required for nitrogen fixation, and a little bit goes a long way. Mostly what we've looked at is protection versus naked seed. And this makes sense. If you're planting your soybean early, you can have a huge value of the seed treatment. I mean, on average, I'm going to tell you seed treatment's worth 2 bushels. Now, early planted soybean, it's almost a prerequisite. Seen advantages up to 8. Late planted, I've seen it be less important. So obviously, protection treatments are going to depend on how long that seed sits in wet, cold soil and is subject to pathogens before it emerges. But a lot of things can go in the seed.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in the micronutrients on the seed. To me, that's a great place to put it because the first drink that root's going to take is packed full with the energy that plant's going to need to really get going.
Yeah, and like I said, I wouldn't believe it if I didn't see it, but we've looked at seed treatments that contain molybdenum, and in some cases, cobalt. These are two elements that are important in nitrogen fixation. And we've seen 2-3 bushels from those, and those aren't very. I mean, it doesn't take much, and so that usually pencils out. Again, the idea is to get that plant off to a better start. I'm pretty sure if I plant the crop early, it's going to make even a bigger difference too, even though we haven't tested that yet. So I told you those 6 factors that in our hands impact soybean yield. I said the weather was worth 30 bushels. And I said you could get 20 of those if you plant early. And then the rest of them, you hope you get the rain at the right time. I told you picking the best variety is worth 30 bushels. And that's especially the fullest relative maturity for the region. I said in some cases, row spacings were 7 bushels, particularly if you plant late, narrow rows, and they're set light faster. I told you foliar protections were 6 bushels. And that doesn't seem to matter when you plant the soybean crop. I told you fertilities were 5. That's P and K fertility. I said it's especially important with later planting, maybe a little less with early, especially if you have a good soil and it can supply the nutrients. And I told you seed treatment was worth 2. If I got the math right and add all those up, that's 80 bushels. And I will guarantee you, if you have one of those non-optimized, you're going to grow less than 80 bushels, and that's pretty easy. The thing I didn't tell you, I alluded to it briefly, is all those things interact with each other. So those 6 factors all interact with each other, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. And to grow more than 80 bushels, those record growers, you got to grow 100, you have to have positive interactions. If I can have the seed treatment help me with the foliar protection or with the fertility, that's a positive interaction. So hopefully this discussion has highlighted some of those things that do impact soybean yield every year, and hopefully understanding those management factors that have an impact that allows you to focus on what's most important. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to increase soybean yield. I think we mostly haven't paid as much attention to soybean as we need to.
I'd agree with that. Is there any more questions for the room? What about tillage?
Yeah, so the question's related to tillage, and again, when I plant soybean in tilled soil, it seems to come out of the ground faster, it looks better, but then in the end it yields the same. And then I struggle with that. Remember, when soybeans yield isn't made right at the beginning. So I think that if you think about tillage or no tillage, it is designed to mostly to conserve moisture. And if moisture is your biggest problem later in the season, and by not tilling the soil, I can conserve a little bit, it can go a long way. So tillage is not one of the soybean secrets because it doesn't seem to make that much difference. Now, no doubt, there's some certain geographies or soil types that either tolerate or don't tolerate a certain tillage more than the other. But in general, I think because soybean yield is so largely made in August that no-till in August helps me conserve water, it doesn't make that much difference.
Now in northern Iowa, emergence of beans has been a big deal, and when we no-till, you can tell. I mean, when driving around, you can see it's always a lot later. And like he said, in the end, it really doesn't seem to matter. But the guys that have went to these 15-inch rows, they put row cleaners on. We even had farmers put row cleaners on their drills, and that seems to make a huge difference. That's been our experience.
Question, and what about additional fungicide applications on soybeans, either late June or even R4, R5?
Yeah, I get that question quite a bit. The question is multiple fungicide applications on soybean. And I said that R3 is the time to make a one-time application, largely because you're controlling the middle of the plant where 60% of the pods and yields come from. So those are the leaves I want to protect. Some growers, and I think this is also true of the record growers, they put it on more than once. We have looked at R2 and R4. And by gosh, it makes the upper part of the crop look better. I mean, like I told you, usually I look at the crop, looks like I took a shotgun to it. But I've not seen an increase in yield over the one time that would pay.
What are you using for fungicides?
I don't want to go into brand names because I don't that's me making
Talk about AI.
making an endorsement. It would be a mix of the strobilurin and the triazole mixture.
And that's still been adequate?
Yes.
Because there's been, a lot of the bean diseases now are resistant to strobilurins.
Yeah, I mean, so I use one of we use one of the national brand names, but I don't want to go into it.
Another question came in. If you've got a history of white mold on your farm, what's the best way to manage it in soybeans?
Yeah, so one of the reasons that we wouldn't grow a narrow row is because of white mold. So obviously, if you have a history of white mold, you should probably be in a 30-inch row. You should pay particular attention to the variety selection, and there are the contends. There are ways that you can try and control the sclerotia. It's you have to commit to it. The first thing I would do is make sure I had enough air movement down the row, and I'd look at the variety.
Now, we have seen cover crop help
Interesting.
considerably in northern Iowa. Matter of fact, when we first started doing a lot of cover crop about 10 or 15 years ago, guys would split their fields, and see, well, how much did I gain with the cover crop? And I always told them that it doesn't work that way, it's over a period of time. Well, one of my good friends tried it, and he brought his yield map in. He's like, there's 9 bushels difference where we put cover crop, where we didn't. And it was all 100% white mold. I don't know whether there's been some tests, there's been some studies written about it, and there seems to be some suppression of white mold by the cover crop, and it might just be the physical grass there on the soil, keep the dirt from splashing up. But there is something quite considerable on cover crop and white mold.
Interesting. I was not aware of that, but I agree with the covering the soil and keeping the inoculum from splashing up. Does make sense.
All right. Any more, Pound?
Nope, nothing. Anything else for the crowd? Any other questions?
All righty. Sounds good.
Well, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to come to Nebraska from the University of Illinois and be able to talk to Nebraska growers and agronomists. So thank you so much for having me on this podcast and for my co-hosts here. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for coming. And made sure you tune in again.
Well, when I came, I told my wife and family that I was going to get to talk to Dr. Fred Below, and they're like, who's that? I'm like, it's like the Michael Jordan of the ag world. So, Fred, I appreciate the time you've given and all the stuff you've taught me. Thank you.
My pleasure.